I spent a year creating the pilot episode of an animated TV show, and today I'm going to talk about how I did it and why. This is the first time I'm really talking about this project, at least with anyone not in my immediate circle. So bear with me because I'm pretty nervous about sharing it, since it really was my life for about a year. It feels personal, but also something I want others to enjoy. Anyways, let's dive in, and feel free to use the timestamps in the description below to skip around, since this is a pretty long video. If you've seen some of my previous videos, you'll probably remember that I was the caregiver for my dad, who had the extremely unfortunate luck of being diagnosed with a brain tumor, glioblastoma. You can watch those videos if you're interested in learning more, but suffice it to say, it was a horrible illness. For him, definitely, and for me as well, as his son and someone who tried to advocate for his care in every way possible. Even more than a year since his death, I still dream about him most nights and think about him a lot more than I did when he was alive, actually. And all this is to say that the experience continues to have a profound effect on my life, how I view myself, how I see the future, and most relevant to this video, how I want to spend my time. All the way back in 2006, while I was home from college for the summer, I happened to be flipping channels and caught the first episode of the second season of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I really enjoyed it, but I sort of put it out of my mind until later that year when I was living abroad in Rome and I got super sick with an E. coli infection. Think food poisoning times 100. It took me months to fully recover, but it was during the first couple of weeks that The Last Airbender popped up in my mind as something to follow up on. I downloaded the first season from iTunes and quickly became obsessed. Like, actually obsessed. I pored over every little bit of info, each trailer they released in the lead up to season 3, formulating fan theories and just reveling in the world Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko created. I loved the fullness of the world, the simplicity yet depth of the characters and their progression, the fight choreography, the intertwining storylines, the stakes, everything. To this day, I still consider it a perfect piece of media, or at least as close to perfect as anything can be. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that watching that show changed something in me. It sparked an interest in creating my own animation. I already knew I wanted to be an author, to create fantasy worlds for others to enjoy, and I also already knew I liked art. But it wasn't until I saw The Last Airbender that I realized animation is the perfect fusion of my interests. But life and capitalism got in the way. I needed to earn a living, and since I graduated into a major recession in 2008, my choices were pretty limited. I managed to eventually get a job, and that job led to another opportunity and another, and before I knew it, I was quite a bit older and no closer to figuring out how to pursue, this animation interest. It just sort of became one of those things in life, those things that you kind of figure you'll do at some point, but don't quite have a plan or even a notion of how you'll do it. Then came my dad's diagnosis. His care, ensuring his journey, let's call it, was as smooth as it could be given the limits of medicine, became my primary focus. Worrying about him and doing my best by him wiped away everything else, and when I came out the other side and he didn't, I was changed in some fundamental way that I'm still struggling to understand. One small part of that change was my decision to take a year and do this thing I've always wanted to do, make an animation. I already had the story from the first book I ever wrote, The Other Side of Gold, and I went to school for art, believe it or not, and in the years since, I'd done enough experimenting in animation to know my way around. Crucially, I knew enough to understand that animation is incredibly expensive, especially the kind that appeals to me. 2D frame by frame, where each frame that includes movement is basically a new drawing. You want to have a character lift their arm, well, you have to draw that arm's position every step of the way. It's a lot, and I didn't and don't have the money to hire animators. I knew I'd have to do pretty much everything myself. First, there's the script. That part's easy. I could pull dialogue and scenes from my novel, making modifications for the new format. Because I wanted to make a pilot episode of a theoretical TV show, I decided to include some things that don't appear until much later in the book. I really wanted the first episode to ask and answer a ton of questions while still leaving plenty hanging. I also wanted to showcase at least one strong action scene. So I worked for a few weeks writing and rewriting the script while also plotting out the remaining 9 episodes of the season. Second, voice acting. I could voice a couple of smaller parts myself, but this is where I knew I needed to spend a bit of money. I wanted talented actors who could bring the characters to life. Luckily, there are a few websites that cater to this need. I primarily source talent from Voice123, which allows you to receive multiple auditions for any role. There are other sites that provide this service as well, but the downside of using multiple sites is that it's easier to hire in the future if you fill the majority of roles you post. In other words, if you post voice acting jobs across multiple sites, future voice actors will see that you have posted a bunch of jobs without actually hiring anyone, and you'll be less likely to attract the most talented actors. I'm incredibly happy with the actors I found, and I can't thank them enough. Third, there's all things pre-production. I had some of this covered because I'd already made a bunch of drawings when I was writing the book, mostly to help me imagine the characters and places. I refined these during my pre-production phase, often having to drastically simplify character design. Since I'm only one person, I knew I couldn't realistically draw the characters exactly as I imagined them, because the more details I added, the longer it would take. So I simplified, and I wound up with character designs I'm not entirely happy with. Then I did a bunch of storyboarding, though I didn't dive in shot by shot, again because of time limitations. I knew I'd have to partially rely on my imagination and script scene descriptions when animating. Fourth, all the sounds. I absolutely did not have money to hire composers, so I mostly licensed existing music through a couple of stock sound websites. The same goes for the Foley effects, like the crunching of leaves beneath someone's feet or the swish of fabric. I pulled from existing licensed libraries. Fifth, and finally, we come to the animating itself, and this is really what held me back for the longest time. I first learned to animate in Toon Boom Harmony and TV Paint. These are both professional applications that allow you to pretty much make anything you can imagine. And the downside of their capabilities, though, are twofold. First, the expense. They cost a lot. And second, the depth of their capabilities makes them cumbersome. Toon Boom is at its best when displayed on a large Wacom monitor with a keyboard by your hand for shortcut access. I just didn't want to spend all my time hunched over my desk. I wanted portability, and no matter how I customized the interface, I couldn't find a comfortable fit on a portable machine. Your mileage may vary, of course, but this is just how I felt. What I really wanted was to use my iPad. I loved the idea of being able to bring my animation with me wherever I went, to work on it when I'm away, to sit on the couch while my partner watches TV and still be able to draw. Unfortunately, at the time, nothing really existed that would allow this experience. I tried a number of apps, which I won't mention here because I'm not a fan of bad-mouthing other developers' hard work. Just when I'd given up on the idea, the team behind Procreate, my favorite drawing app, announced Procreate Dreams, an animation app. I have a whole other video on this topic, which you can find linked below, and while this app is deeply flawed, it was promising enough to get me started. The list of things Dreams can't do is almost bigger than the list of things it can. Still, I wound up animating 23 minutes of finished footage in Dreams on my iPad. I did all of the editing on a proper computer, but the drawing mostly all took place in Procreate. I worked so much on it that I think my iPad may have finally earned its Pro moniker, which, is a big discussion in the tech world, whether you can call an iPad a Pro device or not. Now, let's talk about how much work it really was. I'm not complaining, mind you. In fact, I loved the process, but I want to share the magnitude of this undertaking, as well as what I did to make it easier on myself, and also some choices I made that made things way harder. I already mentioned that I simplified my character designs, so that was a good start for making things easier. Beyond that, I also saved in a Procreate file every single facial expression I drew for every character, so I could go back and pull from that library. I wound up with probably hundreds of faces, and it really sped things up for me because I didn't have to worry so much about character consistency, especially as time went on. When it came to motion, I tried to plan for reuse where possible. There are a few times where a character will adopt the same walk cycle in a different scene, for example, though I hope it's not too noticeable. Then, when it came to backgrounds, I made a major compromise. And having been trained in art school with traditional media, oil paints mostly, I always sort of transferred that ideology to my digital work. If I wanted to draw leaves on a tree, for example, I would achieve that effect just like I would with regular oil paint, only with a digital oil brush. Now, is this ridiculous? Possibly, probably, definitely in the case of this animation. So I collected new brush libraries in Procreate, giving me access to foliage, rock, water, cloud, dirt textures. And this way I could use a leaf brush to make tree leaves, for example. And I can't help but feel that I lost, some of the artistry by using these sorts of brushes, but it was necessary for time's sake. Next, I want to tackle the elephant in the room, AI, artificial intelligence. And to be clear, there is none of that in the final animation, with one partial exception which I'll get into in a bit. But I did occasionally use it for brainstorming. Let me give you an example. The main city in my story, Stamatis, has a giant golden tree over sparkling white towers. I'd drawn it many times, long before AI even existed in the way it does today. But I wanted more inspiration beyond what I could get from real-life images, so I described the city to Midjourney, and it made me a number of versions based on my outline. It generated some interesting imagery that gave me ideas, and I kept a few of those images on the screen while I drew. I'm still not sure how I feel about this. There's environmental concerns with AI, obviously, and there's also plagiarism concerns, since these companies basically stole everything humanity has ever produced to train their models. I'm curious to hear what you think about this. How guilty or not guilty should I feel about using AI in this way? Right now, I'm down the middle, where I strongly believe in human creativity, yet can see the use of AI as a sort of muse or brainstorming partner. The one case where AI appears in the animation is in one segment of a song near the end. I'm not a musician, at all, but I imagined a very specific sort of sound for this particular sequence. I first explored hiring a composer, but anyone I liked was way out of my price range, and cheaper options on Fiverr and other sites might just have been using AI themselves. So I worked inside Udio until I got it to produce something close to what I imagined. It sort of left a sour taste in my mouth, and I'm not sure I'd do it again.
While editing, I remembered one other way I used AI, and that's Photoshop's generative fill, which I occasionally use to expand some drawings around the edges to give me wiggle room when it comes to camera movements. I just move my drawing into Photoshop, expand the canvas, and allow the generative fill to invent some extra imagery. Now, theoretically, Adobe is licensing material they use to train their AI models, but who really knows?
Now, this brings us to frame rate. There are some AI tools that do a decent job of frame interpolation, meaning they will insert additional frames to increase the frame rate of your animation. And modern graphics cards actually do this pretty much every time you play a video game nowadays, so that you can play at a higher frame rate than the card itself can produce with raw horsepower alone. I actually didn't use any of this tech in my animation, though I may do at some point. and here's why. My animation is mostly done at 12 frames per second. For reference, movies are generally shot at 24 frames per second, while television is shot at about 30 frames. There are some exceptions, like The Hobbit, where you could see it at 60 frames per second, but that just looks like insanely weird to me. At 12 frames, your brain actually does a sort of natural frame interpolation, filling in the empty space between frames so that you still perceive the images as motion. I only animated at 24 frames per second for the main action sequence, where motion was just too fast for 12 frames to properly capture it. But this sequence alone took more than twice as long. A couple of minutes took me about 3 months, so I think a good use of AI would be to add frames. In animation, you have what are called keyframes. You can think of these as sort of like the main poses a character hits as they go through their motions. The frames in between these keyframes are called tweens, and those kind of boil down to a lot of busy work. And maybe they can be handled by a computer, or even should be. It would eliminate a ton of manual labor while not really impacting the creative purity of the project. But not everything I did made things easier. In fact, I made some choices that made things harder for myself by not resorting to some of the tricks animations often employ to save money. For example, during dialogue, you'll often see panning shots of a background or just the back of a character's head. This means that the animators don't have to animate the character's facial expressions or even their mouths. But to me, this always feels more like a comic book and less like a TV show. I wanted my animation to really feel like a proper TV show, and that meant planning and executing shots without these kinds of shortcuts. Though I did make sure to place my characters in situations where there wasn't a ton of extraneous motion, like background characters. What else did I do that made things harder? Well, I knew very early on that I was absolutely going to draw a shadow pass. Without a shadow on the character, the animation feels much less dynamic. This meant every frame needed a separate drawing on top of it, basically to add the shadows. What I didn't decide until nearly the end that I was also going to want to add gradient shading so that the characters would have smooth transitions from light to dark. This is like a compositing step in a traditional animation workflow, and it really brings the drawings to life.
Now, I want to be very, very careful with how I talk about this. I'm not an animation expert when compared to basically anyone who's been in the industry for years. Also, most long-form animations have whole teams working on them. So not only are the animators a lot more talented than I am, they also just have more people. That's the limitation I'm currently facing, since I have no Hollywood or entertainment industry connections nor access to pitch the show to anyone who could provide more resources. At least not yet. Let's stay optimistic, right? All this is to say, I'm still learning. I've gotten a lot of good constructive feedback here and on Reddit, though I'm of the mindset that I'd still like to push forward making this show even as I work to find an audience and improve my skills as an animator. I don't really buy into the idea that you have to just make little practice exercises until you're perfect. Now, put it this way. 2 years from now, would I be happier looking back and seeing maybe 300 practice animations that improved my skills, or a few episodes of this animation that are flawed, yes, but also wound up improving my skills? To me, the answer is obvious, though from some of my conversations and feedback I've gotten, different people have differing opinions on this. Lastly, let's talk about the future. I'm finalizing the next 9 scripts, and I intend to record at least some of the dialogue soon. I'm also exploring hiring animation students or recent graduates to help out with some sequences. I'd also like to submit the pilot to animation festivals to try and network a bit, though I'm about as bad at networking as a human being can be. I truly enjoy creating the animation, but social media is not, let's say, a natural way for me to express myself. To that end, I budgeted a few $100 on some ads to get a few more eyes in front of the animation to help grow the channel just a little bit, and to see if anyone besides me actually enjoys this thing.
If it turns out people do, I may eventually make a Patreon or something like that to raise money towards paying animators. I don't intend to keep any funds myself, as all proceeds of fundraising efforts would go entirely into the project for the foreseeable future. I really want to make this thing so very badly, and I intend to make it happen. Anyway, you can check out the first 10 minutes of the finished pilot on my channel. I'll leave you with a clip of an action sequence I'm animating from episode 8, just because I'm really excited about it right now. And do consider subscribing. I want to be honest and transparent throughout this entire process, which I hope you'll join in on one way or another. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.